Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for today is Brady Josephson, who is the VP of Marketing and Growth at, you've heard of it, Charity Water, a nonprofit bringing clean and safe water to people around the world, where he leads a team of storytellers, creatives, and marketers responsible for growing, supporting, and celebrating the charity water community and their impact. He is also a self-described charity nerd. Brady received a master's degree in nonprofit administration from North Park University and has spent his entire career in the philanthropic space. He has researched fundraising while at Next After, one of my favorite places to follow, and provided digital services to charities through his own company and worked in marketing roles for international organizations. As an international speaker, adjunct professor, and 5-time fantasy football champion, Brady lives just outside Nashville, Tennessee, with his wife, Liz, son, Hendrix, and dog, Melly. Welcome, Brady. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. Before we get started, is there anything you'd like to just share about yourself personally as a whole being or professionally for our audience to know?
Wow, that is a very nice open-ended question. Well, first, thanks for having me. It took us a while to schedule, but I'm happy to be here and have the opportunity to share some of what I've learned and what we're learning. Let's see, anything open-ended? I would say one thing that is really formative for me, and I like to talk about, is I'm an adoptive father, and
I love that.
one of the things around adoption is it's getting better. There's less stigma around it, but one of the things is to take the opportunity to share about our story and being adoptive parents and our son being adopted and try to reduce some of the stigma, but also personally, professionally, it's been such a huge piece of my story in the second half of my career, resetting expectations and what is life about, what is career about, learning a lot about empathy. And so, if anyone ever wants to chat adoption, come find me because it's something really, really important to me and my wife and our family.
I love that. And how long have you been an adoptive father for?
6 years. So we brought Hendrix home when he
6
was 11
years.
days, 11
Hmm.
days old. So pretty much his whole life, he's been with us. His mama Danielle's in the picture. He's got 2 stepsisters. It's great. We're making it work.
I love that. I love that. Well, I could do the whole interview on that, but we're but we're not. Maybe another time.
All right.
So
Sounds
we're going to
good.
talk about nonprofit marketing, things that you've been doing for a long time here. I'm going to have to draw connections to that because I think, being, I'm not an adoptive parent, but I'm a parent of a child who has a lot of challenges and I'm a single mom. And there is a lot of
Mm,
that reimagining what success looks like. And I think that really ties,
mm,
at least for me, into the work of marketing and promoting nonprofits, getting clear on, what does success look like here? Because that's a
yeah.
challenge, I think, in the nonprofit space. In the for-profit space, it's easy. Success looks like profit, and if you do some good in the world at the same time, even better. But that can be
Mm,
slippery in nonprofits, but seems critical to messaging. So maybe we can transition into that. Um, you sometimes talk about future demand. So let's start there. What
mm.
is future demand and why is it important?
Yeah, great. So this is a relatively new kind of topic or area for me. It's kind of been a year and a half journey so far into the world of future demand. And so, high level future demand, it's this concept from a guy named James Herman who wrote a book called Future Demand. But in its simplest form, it's really how do you create an interested market in what you have to sell who may purchase in the near future. So
Mhm.
6 months plus. So in our space, it's more like, okay, how are we building interest or awareness or demand of likely people who can donate into the future,
Mm.
as opposed to those who give right now. And that's current demand, people who give today. And the reason why I think that's so impactful to kind of think about it that way, one, it's pretty simple. It's either future demand or current demand. There's only two kind of sides of the coin. There's not six or eight. It's not overly complicated. And one is kind of building towards the future, and one's kind of focused on the here and now. And what really clicked in for me with that is something that we're experiencing at Charity Water, where we're a relatively well-known brand within the nonprofit space, a little bit less so in the general market, and definitely less so today than we were maybe 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing that we've come across is saying, "Hey, we do a decent job of capturing current demand. We are struggling to create enough future demand to pave the way for growth in the future." And I think that parallels what we as a nonprofit space experience and so many nonprofits experience themselves, is we are so current demand focused, raising money year over year, month over month, quarter to quarter, whatever it might be. And all of the literature that I've created, you maybe have created, a lot of us have contributed to how to optimize for the donation or improve your campaign. There's very, very little out there in the space specific to nonprofits around how do you grow a brand or how do you grow something, not like by luck or organic, but like through strategy and investment. And so that language of future demand, current demand is something that we've been using a lot. And I think, again, it's something that we have underinvested in at Charity Water, and as the nonprofit and philanthropic space, I think we've severely underinvested in it. And now we're kind of seeing the unintended fruits of the lack of investment, where we're raising more money from fewer people. And that is not a new trend. And it's really, really hard to reverse. So that concept, I think, is really important, and it makes it a little bit easier to talk about, I think, in terms of future demand or current
I
demand.
love that. That's a new term to me, but not a new concept. And I think in the for-profit space, they're much better at this about branding and content marketing that does this. I actually have a for-profit client who specializes in content marketing. And I've been using the term, like, I think content marketing really works for, I was calling it the long tail, right? The people who kind of know
Hmm.
who you are, but they're not ready to buy now, or they're not ready to give now.
Yeah.
And what she does with her services is really good for bringing that long tail along. But I love that the future demand, because I kept thinking like long tail is kind of a little, it just sounds a little technical or something, but future
Yeah.
demand makes so much sense. And how do you not just build out an audience of potentials, but those people who aren't ready now that are going to be ready in the future, you need to help guide them, right? Lay out a path that, brings them to your door. Don't just wait for them to do it on their own, because they very well may end up at somebody else's door if you're not, bringing them along on on a journey to you. I love that. Tell me a little more about I want to dig into future demand a little more. So, what are the pieces that you are working on developing to create future demand?
Yeah, so there's a few kind of key principles. So if you really get into it, and again, you can go down the rabbit hole. There's a lot of other things in there, but one of the key concepts is you can't build future demand and current demand at the same time.
Mm.
Well, so you either have to, like, if you focus on current demand only, you do a better job at getting current demand. If you focus on future demand only, you do a better job. So you can kind of do both, but it's really hard to do both well. So you basically do have to choose one or the other. And so for us, again, in the world of fundraising, especially international causes where we don't have service revenue, we don't have health and hospital and things like that. Traditionally, so much of the brand building comes through direct response. And that is very limited when it comes to building brand affinity, because almost the only time you hear from an organization is when you're asked, or
Mhm.
kind of to prepare for the next ask. And so while we've become better at that, if that's still part of a fundraising based strategy, it's not from a future market strategy. So part of that is thinking about your comms mix, or thinking about how to offset fundraising with more of this kind of brand building or affinity building. And then that leads you down a path of channel mix. So when you look at like brand recall and the way that people remember messages or things like that, things like TV is
Mhm.
actually really good.
Mhm.
And so TV now obviously can be on your device, it can be on your screen, it can be even like YouTube type content, but non kind of paid social video is really good on out of home advertising is really good on brand recall. So that's partly why these big brands, yes, they have big budgets, but when they're trying to impose or inflict kind of a memory, you need like 2.5 seconds of attention, and attention is actually really, really hard to get,
Yeah.
especially if you're playing in more traditional bottom funnel channels, whether it's like display advertising or more so paid social or paid ads or even emails or even direct mail. Like it's really hard to garner attention. And so if you said, and this is what we're kind of proving out and testing, we really want to invest in future demand, it would shift your channel mix. We know those people won't give
Right.
today. We know it's a long tail.
Mhm.
It's in the future. But you can't just try to take a future demand strategy and not change your messaging or your mix. So that's one of the big applications of this. And so we actually said, half the budget is future demand, half the budget is current demand, different channel mixes, slightly different messages. Because you can't just say, oh, yeah, we just want to flip over to future demand and not change enough things,
Yeah. Can you give an example, like for those who are, trying to keeping up with the conversation and don't speak brand speak as clearly, like an example of a
Yeah.
current demand message versus a future demand message?
For sure. So a really good example is how we use video. So we use video a lot to acquire donors on YouTube, for example. And so a current demand for us is kind of like a 2-minute video that has a pretty good arc, kind of problem and solution. There's normally a character. We use a lot of emotion in our storytelling, and then it ends with a join today. Sometimes join the spring or monthly giving program, but a pretty clear ask. And even sometimes just $40 helps provide clean water to one person. Join us at charitywater.org. So that's kind of like a current demand type ask. A future demand type ask are some of these new ads where we'll have concepts like a slip and slide, where a child at a birthday party goes on the slip and slide and there's no water,
Right.
screeches to a halt. We say, water changes everything. That is not compelling to give
Right.
at all. There's no ask, there's no offer. It's 30 seconds, but the hope is that you would remember either the ad for its creativity or if it's humor or it's so
Makes you
different
go,
than another
"Huh," or
nonprofit.
laugh. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, you just want someone to do some kind of lean in moment so that you could have the chance to kind of be memorable. And so if we took the same approach in a 30-second clip to try to get someone to remember charity water, where it's like that longer form, like, that's actually really hard to do. 30 seconds is not a lot to, like, move someone emotionally to the point where they actually wanna give, so that's a different purpose or intent. So both using video, but you're kind of tweaking the approach based off the channel or
Yeah.
story. And most commonly, I think it's, like, a lot of direct mail, if, current demand is obviously, like, give today, we have a match, pretty traditional,
Campaign
high urgency
oriented.
kind of
Yeah. Mhm.
correct, campaign oriented, but, like, that's not memorable. You're not building up your brand equity. I don't really know. I don't have any more affinity for it. It might be a great giving moment, and the offset might be something like a postcard that points you to a QR code that points you to a video that talks about the vision for the future. Something like that. But again, it's really hard to do both at once. So it's really trying to take a bifurcated strategy of saying, are you trying to capture current demand, or are you trying to build future demand?
Yeah. I love that. So how, I want to shift over to monthly giving, which hopefully everybody knows is important. But I'd love to hear, your thoughts about monthly giving and how do you maybe begin to think about monthly giving and this connection. I want to keep going back to future demand to solidify this concept for people. How do those two things connect and in the spectrum of, kind of, well, if I can call it on demand giving, right? Campaign oriented, like give now. And then we've got the, that kind of keep giving, recurring giving. And then we have this like future demand. Put those into perspective for me and also talk a little bit about monthly giving, which I don't think still gets enough attention.
Yeah, yeah. So I think both monthly giving and future demand are a bit more longer term, more sustainable focus in terms of how we can raise revenue sustainably, right?
Hmm.
A monthly donor's lifetime value is 5 times higher than a single time donor, and they're more likely to leave legacy gifts and give more over their lifetime in a longer period of years. So it is kind of playing the long game and saying, hey, we'd rather get more revenue and more engagement with more donations over time than just kind of a donation today. And now that's something that other countries in particular have been doing for a long time in the US is, we're doing a lot better today in monthly giving than we were in the past. Um, so the connection for us at least is we have a hard time finding people who are ready to become a monthly donor today without investing more in the future demand. You
Yeah.
put a lot of pressure on that direct mail package or your data modeling and all these ways that we go around acquisition. It actually gets harder and harder, more and more expensive, and you run out of people who will naturally make a monthly commitment. Because to make a monthly commitment, while it's easier today because it's more convenient, it's more digital, it's still a monthly
Right.
commitment.
Well,
It's
5
not
times more,
as
right?
easy. Correct. And you're committing to give to something every month, almost in
Yeah.
perpetuity. It's a bigger ask, even though it's a smaller financial amount today. It's a bigger emotional commitment investment. So that's part of our theory of how we can grow in the future is saying we've done such a great job at capturing current demand and turning them into monthly donors. We're running out of future demand, so it's making harder to find monthly
Mhm.
donors. So if we can grow future demand, it should be easier to capture monthly donors again in the future. So that's kind of one way that those two concepts relate. And I think the biggest thing for that I've seen at Charity Water and in my time in the space, it's just focus and prioritization. Like there are a lot of tools and tips and tactics, and there's so many better resources today than we have. The biggest thing that none of those things can ever substitute for is making it a clear focus and a huge
So
priority.
true.
And when Charity Water launched the spring, that's what they did.
Mhm.
Everything that they did was about the spring. On the website, in our comms for years, it was like almost to a detriment, the one and only main
Yeah.
thing that was ever asked of you. And so it's not saying that all orgs have to do that, but there is a huge level of focus and prioritization that is needed if you want monthly giving to grow and be a substantial part of your
Yeah,
revenue.
I just wanna, like, highlight that for everyone because, something I don't agree with that I keep seeing online is you need to diversify your funding streams or your revenue streams,
Mm,
and I have yet to meet the nonprofit that really needs to be doing that. Sometimes they're ready to add maybe one more source, but I hear that message a lot, and I don't hear a lot of people saying what you just said, which is you need to focus, right, on promoting and being really great at one type. If you want monthly giving, you got to be focused on that. And so many, or especially smaller organizations, and I think you need to be really big to potentially be doing multiple things. And I mean, really, really big. But for most of you, like, if you're 20 million or under, probably you're still small as far as, diversification, and you need to be picking one thing to be great at. And it should not be, just shouldn't be grants. Just put that out there.
yeah. There's we're having this conversation because we kinda had this dominant, in the world of growth marketing, you call it an engine. We had this growth
Mhm.
engine, and one of the theories is you need one dominant growth
Yep,
engine, and it needs to be so substantial and superior to the others before you even consider adding a
that's
second,
right.
and so I do think that's a good way to approach it. So in this conversation, Stanford Social Innovation Review just had this article of how orgs get really big,
Yeah,
and it's a review of more recent data from 1997 when they did a study. And of the 297 nonprofits that are 50 million and above, 90% of them have one
one,
main
right?
revenue
Yep,
source,
yep,
be it individuals or corporate or philanthropy or
that's
something like that. But it is one dominant revenue stream. So within that, yeah, you need some different elements of diversification. But I'm totally with you. This idea of diversification for diversification's sake is not often great counsel.
solution.
And normally
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, and you don't have the right people, the skills, the capability. Like you've invested all those things, and then to just be like, oh, now we're going to diversify over here. It's a totally different approach. You know what I mean? So again, there are times, and we need to diversify within strategies. But yeah, unnecessary diversification is problematic too.
yeah, awesome. You heard it. Well, we're gonna take a quick break. Then we're gonna come back and get some more tips from Brady. I wanted to take a break to tell you that, as a former executive director, board member, and now trainer and coach to nonprofit leaders for many years, I know your challenges. I know how busy you are. I know how hard you work to get everything done in your organizations. And because of that, my gift to you is on top of this podcast where you can hear tips and inspiration from experts that I'm able to bring in. I'm also going to give you a weekly newsletter, which is more of a bulletin, one topic, one set of short tips related to that topic each week so that you can get a dose of something that is highly implementable and something to inspire you every week. So if you'd like to get the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, you can go to inspirednonprofitleadership.com, and there will be a very obvious sign up button. All right, back to my conversation. So you were at Next After, and like any good marketer fundraiser, you should know probably a lot about testing and optimization. Because, how do we know we're succeeding if we aren't optimizing? And how do we know that what we're doing is the very best activity we could be doing if we aren't comparing a few activities? Will you tell us some of the, top things you've learned over the years, things that you think to pay attention to, or things that you think people should not pay attention to that they maybe do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll try to keep it simple. One of the things we just talked about this with our team is like, hey, should we just really be testing for testing's sake? It kind of, it feels like an extra thing. And my answer was yes. So even if you don't have the perfect tools or how to craft a perfect hypothesis, this idea of always be testing has a lot of immense value just culturally because
Mhm.
it ingrains the sense of curiosity, the sense of we don't actually know what's always working, and anything is kind of up for grabs. And so when you talk about building a culture of testing, one of the first things is you focus on what's called velocity, just how many tests can we get out the door? And you're not even worried so much about the outcomes or the quality of sorts. It's just trying to get kind of familiar with testing as a concept and just really ramp up the speed. And then what you realize is like, oh, we actually can't screw up things that much. This testing thing's actually relatively easy. And then, learning stack upon learnings. And so sometimes we can build it up too big in our minds and all the reasons to not. And so part of it is like, just get started, even if it's not a great test, start learning and developing that muscle.
Yeah.
But then over time, you do have to become more sophisticated and understand, okay, what are high value tests? And we shouldn't just be testing the subject line for the 80th time if it's not a high value test. So part of that is learning a little bit more of where levers are, or like where the bigger levers or areas to grow. And that takes a little bit of sophistication. But for example, if we can get another, 2 or 3% performance increase on our paid acquisition landing page, that's very substantial to the business because of how much we focus on acquisition, the LTV of monthly donors,
Mhm.
and what we put on paid versus a few percentage points increase of, say, an email open rate. Those two things are so far apart in how much business value they generate for us. So not all tests are actually created equal. And you think about, well, what's the outcome of this experiment? And then try to prioritize a little
Mm.
bit. So that's a little bit more sophisticated. And then the last thing maybe is just not a full-blown experiment is not what's, needed all the time. So we try to put things in 3 categories of try, experiment, and pilot.
Mm.
And so try is kinda like, "Hey, we don't actually have, the data or the time or the sample size, um, but we wanna try something," and we have language here at Charity Water called "safe to try," where it feels like, yeah, I don't think you can screw it up that bad, it's safe to
I
try.
love that. That's one of
So it's
my
not a
favorite
full
terms is safe to fail. I didn't create it.
if
It's the same
oh,
kind
yeah,
of
it's the
thing,
same
right? It's the
thing.
exact same.
And that's essentially what you're saying, right? When it's safe to try, it's safe to fail, and you create that kind of environment. But it's not a full-blown A/B test. It won't make it in Next After's resource library as statistically significant, but it's still part of that curiosity. Can we find an answer? Then there is experimentation where it's clear, hypothesis, clear result, much more scientific. And then pilot is where you're often going into, say, a new market or a new channel or something that you want to do over a longer period of time where you don't have a control to test against, but you don't want to just make an investment willy nilly with nothing to compare it against as well. So you'll say, we'll do like a controlled pilot over 3 months or over 6 months and use that. So those are all different forms of testing.
Mhm.
And not everything's an out and out experiment. And I think that's been helpful for us too, to try to unlock different elements of curiosity and testing without forcing everything to be a pretty rigid scientific experiment, which isn't the right tool for all the different
I
jobs.
love that. So I'm a sailboat racer, and we do all those
Ooh.
things, sailboat racing a lot. There's certain things where we're really kind of maybe getting scientific is when we're optimizing. We're taking something that works
Mm,
and trying to make it a
yep.
little bit better. And one of the things I like to think about, in racing, which is a performance sport versus, our nonprofits is that many of you might have heard of like the 80-20 rule where, 20% of the work, it's 80% of the results. When you're really in high performance, like when you're sailboat racing, you're now doing the final 80% of the work to get the 20% of the
Mm,
results, like we'll do a ton of
mm,
work to get a 1 second gain or a 2 second gain. And you
right.
got to love that for it to be fun. So when we're trying to
Mm,
get that gain, we're optimizing, we're making small changes and we're watching the data and we get pretty scientific with our data. But at that other
mm,
end, in that safe to fail, we also like to just try wonky things. Like, what if you
yeah,
rig a sail like really weird? Or what if we, put a sail from another boat? Like, what if we do something that we're sure is not going to be amazing, but we're sure we're going to find those unintended consequences? We're going to discover something valuable
yeah,
that then we can kind of maybe move to the testing level. Like, oh, like somebody, this created a mess or it cleaned something up or it opened up a new idea. And that's one of the things I love, back to kind of business. I like to call, those safe to fail experiments or that culture like of safe to try of like throw spaghetti at the wall, or the refrigerator, that old thing. Like, let's just get
yeah,
messy sometimes and try some things because we're going to have unintended consequences, which are going to lead potentially to opportunities that would not be discovered if you kind of stayed in those more rigid lanes. I think that's
yeah,
so helpful for people to hear. And I also want to just reinforce what you said about not being afraid, right? Like so much of that is like just be brave for a moment, It's a try something and it's not as scary as it
yeah,
sounds once you get doing it.
yeah. No, for sure. I think the other key thing in there too for us is putting things in the try bucket is, can you trust those learnings the same way that you can a more rigid experiment? No, you can't. Right? So you can still learn, but how much you trust the learning does depend on how much you've done the experiment. So, again, the big concept is like, yeah, we should always be learning and always be trying new things. And there's different ways to test depending. Piloting for us has been great for new channels like TV or affiliate, where airport advertising, things like that, is saying we're not just going to go all in.
Right.
We're going to go in with a small bet, see what we can observe, see what changes, and then go for the bigger bet. And I think pilot's a real magic word too,
Oh, yeah.
because it takes the kind of, risk threshold
Right.
down a little
Pressure's
bit
off
and
the
like, "Yeah, we're just gonna
pilot.
pilot it." Yeah, you'd be surprised how the conversation changes when you're just more talking about pilots and not long-term
Yeah, the
commitments.
language we use really can affect the way we think. And it makes me think of the book, is Jim Collins' Great by Choice, which is, I'm not a big fan of Good
Mm,
to Great, but I love Great by Choice. And one of the concepts
mm,
in there is fire bullets, then cannons. And it's that concept you run a pilot, like test something that's safe to fail, that you can do a bunch of and get some data before you fire the big guns and really go all in
yeah,
on something. And if you just kind of take that approach around, I think you discover better pathways and you also feel more confident. And there's a level of fun that comes with trying things, I think,
mm,
that is healthy for nonprofits.
yeah, yeah, it's a good point. You're
All
right.
right. So before we wrap up, I want to turn to one more topic. We talked about future demand, but let's talk about keeping our current demand current with donor retention. What have you learned
Mhm.
about donor retention? I mean, you said, we've got this problem of when we go after current demand, it sounds like donor retention can get a bit challenging. It's almost making me think of, like if you get people giving because they're on an adrenaline giving moment, that's not really sustainable. So what have you been learning and what are you thinking now about donor retention?
Yeah, well, it's such a big topic too. So I think, first, maybe spicy take, and this is still like evolving data and evolving thinking, but I think one of the things for me is that there's actually huge diminishing returns on the donor retention side.
Mm,
So this isn't to say that it's not important. Of course, it's massively important. If we spend all this time and energy to recruit a donor and then they stop giving or they don't give again, that's hugely problematic for us. Where I think it's what I mean by diminishing returns is, I've been in this space a while, and the first time donor retention rate is the exact same today as it was when I first entered the
mm,
space. And maybe the first chunk of that, we weren't talking about it enough, but it's been a pretty big focus for the last chunk. And we've come a long way in our tools and our tactics. And maybe we just haven't focused on it enough. But I at least want to pause and think about the alternative of what if we actually can't maximize donor retention that much more because the fundamental product of charitable giving has some limitations to it. When you think about
Yeah.
mass, right? People give to 3 to 9 causes, and 2 of the only one of those really remains year over year from a, like, high loyalty perspective, more or less. So the rest of us are pretty interchangeable in the eyes of most consumers year over year, but somehow we just constantly criticize ourselves and beat ourselves up because we just can't keep that donor
Yeah.
when maybe their behavior doesn't lend itself to that in the first place. So all that to say, if you're at like 5%, 10%, 50%, then probably there's room to grow. But it's harder to get that last 80% of performance that you're talking
Right.
about. And I think a lot of orgs start reaching that line of diminishing returns, say, well, for us to increase our donor retention now, it takes such a significant investment. We should be thinking about, is that really the best use of our time, energy, or is it actually future demand?
Let me
Is it
ask you a
actually
question.
acquisition again?
If
Yeah.
you're really working on future demand activities, do you think that those same activities delivered to your current donors would be very good for donor retention?
Yes, a lot would. And so, I mean, even some new research next after is doing a lot of longitudinal study about showing TV ads, for example, to prospects that they want to increase retention, and it is having a positive increase in
Yeah.
retention. So much of retention is just about being top of mind and how do you break
Yeah.
through. And so, a lot of future demand strategies in terms of reach and brand shown to the same people is one way to just stay
Yeah.
top of mind. And a lot of these organic channels like social were not
Right?
targeted, but it is a kind of key ingredient to the mix. So I do think there is some wraparound value of future demand, to
Yeah.
retention. But these like fully bespoke retention strategies and life cycling, and we spent a lot of time to rebuild our post donate monthly giving experience. And we got some small gains, but they're pretty
Yeah.
small relative to the amount of time and energy we put into it. So for us, at least our organization was like, I don't know if that's actually a huge lever for us to really increase donor retention.
Yeah.
Sounds lovely, and aspirationally and philosophically, I think we all love it. We want our donors to stay for life. But I think we do have to look in the mirror and go, okay, what is the natural behavior of supporters for certain causes?
I think
And are
maybe,
you swimming upstream at them?
yeah, all of our fundraising activities are going to reach a point of diminishing returns. Some of them you might never reach, right? Like new
For
donors for
sure.
your cause, you might never reach the point where you see those diminishing returns, but I think it's always there in theory, right? And I think of
Yeah.
I can't remember the numbers now, but people who focus on marketing and direct response marketers and in the for-profit space who are really, really good at this and know the data, like there are some numbers given any like email list, there is across any industry, basically a fixed percentage that are ever going to buy.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
once you hit that number, you can increase your list, but you're not going to get a better conversion rate from your list.
Mhm.
It's going to be diminishing returns. And even if you were to go to
Mhm.
the theoretical, right, at the end of the day, there is a market of your donors and there is only a certain percentage of them that are going to donate, right? Of those potential donors. And at some point you might hit that. I think it's important to be aware when you are potentially hitting that point of diminishing return in any of your activities because that 80-20 rule
Yeah.
is 20% of the work gets you 80% of the results, right? So to go beyond the 80% of the results is gonna start to take a lot of work and it's probably not worth it unless you're at the point of diminishing returns in everything you're doing, which is highly unlikely. I mean, I'd be really surprised.
Yeah. No, it's such a good point 'cause, it applies to all these different areas, and the question really is just, like, the opportunity cost,
Yeah,
right? And that is one of the things that I think all businesses, but especially nonprofits, it's one of our hardest things is to say, should we do this instead of that?
yeah,
And the comment is more about like, should you do this instead of that? And at least for us, that's where it's been like where there's a lot of open playing field is that future demand side of things. It may not be donor retention, but we also, I think, do a lot of things really well.
yeah,
Like we tell really good stories. We connect people to the impact of their donations. We have such a heart for supporters of all sizes. Our customer service is amazing. We front load the experience in 30 days. Like a lot of the kind of best practices I think we do really well. So that also then allows us to be more confident in new acquisition strategies or new future demand because we feel like we've built a product and an experience that does a pretty good job at the things you need to do to retain. So again, it's kind of like a seesaw sometimes. Like if you don't have a great experience, you kind of focus on that for a little bit until you feel confident, and then you kind of go back out and maybe more into acquisition or brand building mode, and then you'll probably have to go back and revisit your experience. But it's again this concept of trying to do it all
Yeah.
equally all at once never wins. Never, ever, ever. You
No,
can't.
and I
So,
think what
you know,
you
where are
just
you going
said,
to
like,
fight
for
those battles?
everybody is so, so true. There's like finding new donors, getting those, potential new donors, getting those donors to convert to kind of recurring donors in some format, and then keeping those donors, and you will cycle through. It's not like you're going to pick one of those stages and only focus on that forever, but you got to build it up, and then you send it along in maintenance mode and you build up your next thing, but and then you cycle around because things break over time, or you get better at things and
Yeah.
you can level up, right? You wouldn't want your retention to be so advanced and have like no new people coming in. That would be silly, right? You
Right.
get your retention
Yeah.
I like to think of it as machines, like up and running and churning at a good rate, or a good, working well for the amount of people coming in. And that's now in maintenance mode. And then you go, okay, let's load up that machine. And then, oh boy, that machine's breaking. All right, we got lots of people coming in. We'll leave that in maintenance mode. And then we'll go
Yeah.
and, soup up our, retention machine. And maybe that's to increase retention, or maybe that's just to maintain retention with the new load coming in, because maybe your old system couldn't handle that level of scale as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, how you acquire donors is often the most indicative thing of how likely they are to be retained. There's confounding variables around age, which is tough to isolate, but we know if donors acquired from like Facebook and a paid social channel don't retain at the same rate as people from, say, TV or people from organic search. And so, whatever you do, it's almost like how you acquire them, the message and the channel and the strategy is like it's got its retention curve, and you can only move it so
That's right.
much. So, and you're right, the more you do acquire or the less you acquire, it impacts your retention. So it is this kind of like moving vehicle or whatever analogy we want to use, and keeping them all moving at the same time is important, but really focusing on elements of it, I think you're right, is so
Yeah.
critical.
Well, thank you so much, Brady, for being here. Any kind of final words of wisdom, or if people wanted to thank you or follow your work and your journey, what would you say to them, and how can they follow along with what you're doing?
Oh, just go to charitywater.org. Check it out if you want, join the spring. We'd love you to join, but also if you just want to kick the tires and see what we're doing, and then send me an email or follow and connect on LinkedIn with any ideas, because I think we do a good job, but we can always get better, and there's a lot to learn. So I think that's one of the best ways is to follow other orgs, follow other people, and give to a lot of orgs and see what they do.
Love that. Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you again. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself. Take time for self-care. Maybe throw some spaghetti at that refrigerator and run a safe to try experiment. And be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.